What's up, everybody? Welcome to another episode of Word Slingers. Today we've got John Hervey.
Hey, what's up? How's everybody doing?
Thanks for joining us, man.
Man, I'm excited to be here, brother.
Yeah, it's good to finally meet you face to face and, well, video to video call here.
Isn't it kind of funny? It's like, folks for a long time, whether it's through shows, through chats, but you don't always get a chance, to talk with them.
Right.
So, it's like I've been fortunate enough to be familiar with you through the comic ship, and now it's really cool to be on your show.
Yeah, thanks for coming, man. Yeah, I love the comic shop. We were just talking about that. I'm ready for it to come back.
You and me both, brother.
I miss that music, that Booty from Beyond music.
Let me tell you the thing with Ryan that's so amazing. I mean, there's so many people that are multi-talented,
Yeah.
and he's one of them. So it's not just the comic art; it's also his music ability, and he does just some. I mean, the music he puts together for that show is just
Yeah.
amazing.
It really is. All right, so let's talk about writing, man.
Yes, sir.
How did
That's
you
the
get
one
started?
thing I can do.
There you go. I'm a rookie at it myself, so one of the reasons I'm doing this show is so I can talk to other writers and get to know how they work, so I can steal some ideas from them. Really,
Yeah.
because I'm still learning. So, what got you into writing? How did you get started?
So, writing has been kind of funny. It's been a lifelong pursuit of mine since I started reading comics. As a kid, I probably, if it weren't for comics, I probably wouldn't have even been reading. I
Wow.
had, when I was young, I had very little interest in reading. But comics, aging myself, comics were available at the local drugstore. So my mom would get me comic books, and some of her friends would be like, "Why are you getting him this, this stuff?" But she's like, "Because it's getting him reading." And I went from reading comics and always still reading comics, but then started adding fiction and science fiction, and then moved to biographies. It just gave me reading comics gave me the bug.
Nice.
But the thing is, as a kid, I was always once I started reading comics, it, there's something about the medium of comics because you have it's both a left brain and a right brain exercise. I mean, you've got the writing, but you got the art, and it just really made my imagination flourish. So I started writing voraciously as a kid. So I would write comics. I used to love like those Hanna-Barbera cartoons. So
Yeah.
I would write like Space Ghost comic books and Herculoids and all that kind of stuff. And of course Spider-Man. And,
Right.
but I really can't think of a time, once I started writing that I wasn't writing in some shape or form. And I just, you know, I would make the comics. So back in the day, I would do the art as well as the writing. I didn't pursue the art part vigorously enough, because, but the writing is something I was continually doing no matter what I was doing. So that's always just been a love of mine. That's how I express myself. I express myself through writing.
Right. Oh, that's awesome. So, what's the first thing you ever wrote?
Man. Probably, I mean, in terms of the comics, I'm pretty sure it's probably a Space Ghost comic book.
Really?
And I would write them. I would write them almost like, I'd make them almost like newspaper comics. So I mean, they'd be like one-page stories.
Yeah.
Like Space Ghost would fly in, bust up some villain, and then he'd bounce and go Space Ghost. That was, So they were all
Yeah.
like one page, literally one page.
I love that.
comics,
That's
you know.
awesome.
And the thing you got to realize too, when I was a kid, it's like my kids today, it's like, if they see a show they like, if they see a cartoon they like, they just watch it. They just keep watching it.
Right.
They watch it, but it's like I didn't have that. It's like you had network TV, and when the shows were on, the shows were on. When they
Yep.
weren't, they weren't. So it's like when the shows weren't on, I couldn't just watch them. I was like, I'm gonna go make my own. I'm gonna
There
make
you
my
go.
own Space Ghost adventures. I'm gonna go make my own Spider-Man adventures. So for me, it was just kind of a continuation of the love and the fun, and then having comic books, and I would sometimes some comics, like I really got into the Hulk, and this is where if kind of you use the cross-platform media stuff correctly, it works. So the Incredible Hulk TV show with Lou Ferrigno and Bill Bixby was big.
Yeah.
And I love that show, man. So let me tell you, I started picking up the Hulk, and it was a great run that I picked up. So I picked up the Hulk, was loving the Hulk, was loving the show, was loving the comic books, even though the show and the comic books were different.
Yeah.
And that's when you start kind of noticing the difference. I was like, man, in the comic he's Bruce Banner, and the show he's David Banner.
Yeah.
And then, so like, but you don't care. I'm like, there's no Betty in this show, but I'm fine.
Right.
It's still the Hulk. He's traveling around. He's, trying to be helpful to folks, and someone throws him in the cement mixer, and he turns into the Hulk, and the whole nine. But you realize the kind of, you get the creative juices flowing. So I started. I would pick up comics. So I was big on the Hulk, and I would get like a Hulk comic and I would read it, and then I would make comments picking up the story where that comic left off.
Oh, nice.
So I started making my own subsequent issues to comics. Then the next issue would come out, I read it, and I'm like, okay, well, this is where they went. Well, then I start to make my own story after that. So for me, I mean, comics were a great escape. They were a great jumping on point for me from a creativity standpoint, because I could work with pre-established characters. I could see how writers were crafting stories, and then I kind of tried to come alongside and say, okay, well, this is where this story is going, and this is what he's done with these different characters. Let me see what I can do.
It's a great writing exercise, even like to read a comic book and then like jump on there and try to finish off the story.
It's a fun. It wasn't even something I was doing it just purely out of the fun of it. But the thing that I realized is it was starting to teach me, and I noticed it as I was writing. It was starting to teach me how to pace comics. Because especially as a kid, like I told you, I made one-page Space Ghost comics. Space Ghost flies in, busts up the bad guy, and flies out. There's no development. There's nothing else going on.
Right.
I just want to see him use his powers, and we're good to go.
Yeah.
But then you start to grow in your writing. I started understanding, particularly in the Hulk, I started understanding Banner better. I started understanding Rick Jones. I started understanding his supporting cast. Then I started understanding some of his villains. So I started to try and actually write stories, that were continuing the stories that I read.
Right.
And I think for anyone that's a writer, just like an artist, I mean, an artist has to be continually practicing their craft, and the things you're doing aren't always things for publication. I feel it's the same across any kind of discipline. Whether you're writing or whether you are an artist, or even if you're an athlete, you need to spend the majority of your time in the lab, so to speak.
Yeah.
So for me, writing is a daily exercise, and it's not, and there's some percentage of the stuff that I write actually makes to print, a very small percent. But the good thing is, it frees you to create, because the reality of the matter is, as much as I'd like to believe everything I create is awesome, it's not.
Right. Yeah.
But you have to have the freedom and the liberty to create, to write. One of the big keys to writing is rewriting, editing. You come up with an idea, and kind of the way I like to write, I'll usually have a big idea, or a story arc idea, and I like to put a structure together. So I'll use, like, if you've been reading any of my series as of late, a lot of them have almost like a movie type structure. It's like a 12-beat structure. You've got a six issue series, and basically the 6 issues flow in such a way that by the end of the 6th issue, you've completed that story arc and you've gotten whatever button you're going to get, and now you're able to move on to the next story arc.
Nice.
But there's so many ways to write. So I've been writing a lot of stories, especially when I'm trying to establish characters in a world and trying to get people to understand who a character is. So I'm like, these 6-issue arcs have been really good for me, but then I'm also writing stories in much shorter arcs. So I'm starting to write some 2-issue arcs. So and I'll tell you why. I've been writing comics for a very long time. I've written in different media, so animation and TV and movie writing, and it's all very different because of the tools that you have available. Actually, the most freedom you have in writing is either in prose or in comics, because with both of those, you're not as financially limited as you are when you're writing for TV or you're writing for movies, because you can write something and the big problem is, okay, what's the budget to do what you're trying to execute?
Right.
And I think part of the problem one of the numerous problems we're seeing in modern corporate comics, I'll call them corporate comics, is that a lot of these comics are being written for other media. And once you do that, that's where you have all the talking heads. That's where you're doing all these things, because they're writing it like they're writing a TV show. They write it like they're writing a movie, like a low budget movie. So they're like, okay, well, if this is going to translate, we can only have 5 minutes of action in this 45-minute show.
Yeah.
And then all of a sudden you start reading these comics, you're like, wow, this is boring. Oh man, you're killing me, Smalls.
Right.
But so one of the beauties to me of comics is, your constraints, your page rate, but your page rate really from an artist for the most part, it's not going to fluctuate. If you want to pay that artist to do a whole bunch of talking heads, they'll do that artist at their page rate. If you want to take them all the way across the galaxy, they'll do it at the same page rate.
Right.
If you want to have some awesome action sequences, so you realize that, like, okay, what's really constraining me here? It's the way I'm conceiving my story, which is why I say, even if you're using beat structures like TV beat structures or movie beat structures, you can't write it like a TV show or a movie. You got to write it like a comic. So you should with a comic, especially an action series, a sci-fi series, a superhero series, you should be able to keep the action flowing. You should be able to continue to move the story forward, hit the beats you're trying to hit, but you shouldn't need for it to be talking heads to do that. I feel like if we're doing that, we're not taking advantage of the medium that comics, is.
It's a really good point. I love that. I never considered that. Yeah.
And that was just really one of my takeaways just from writing different media, because I started off as a comic writer, and then as I did some other writing for TV and editing and for movies, that was always one of the biggest I guess things that were edited in my writing were like, the things you write are too big budget.
Yeah.
It's like, this is great, but it's like, we can't do this.
Yeah.
We can't do this on a budget that anyone is gonna want to work with. And that's why I think that, comics are done best when they're written for the medium. And it sounds silly, sounds almost ridiculous to say, but you got to write comics to the strength of what comics are. And it is, it's like, it's the motto of Beyond Time Comics, boundless imagination. That's what it is. You are unbounded when you're writing comics, and you should be unbounded. You're not worried about, well, man, how much is this scene going to cost in terms of the budget if you bring it to life? No, just make your comic, have fun.
Yeah, no, I love that, because you're right. A lot of what I see in comic books today is, this is just a means to an end. Like, yes. I'm gonna get that Netflix TV show, or I'm gonna get that 3 movie deal franchise.
Mm-hmm.
And so you're right. Like, the comic books are written that way.
It's funny. The comic books today are written that way, but when you look at all the content that these corporate comics are using to turn into their shows, it's all the old stuff.
Yeah,
it's all the old stuff.
Very
because the old stuff was well written. It didn't. A lot of it's getting changed in some ways, but that material, you could tell it was just like guys like us, people that love comics, love the characters, love the medium, and are looking to put the best put their best foot forward. And I feel like that's what the indie market is doing right now.
Yeah.
Is the indie market, and there's still some books probably here and there, that are still doing a good job. I mean, I enjoyed uh, Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles: Last Ronin.
Mm.
I enjoyed that series. That was a series that recently came out. Um, I've actually been going back and because as much Robert Kirkman stuff is out there, I really hadn't read a lot of it.
Yeah.
I mean, so a buddy of mine a number of years back he let me borrow his Walking Dead compendium, so I read that, and I've been picking up Invincible now, and I'm reading it. I'm enjoying it. It's I guess I'm a little bit older school. I mean, it's just it's gory for me, but it's
Yeah.
but it's but you know what? But I'm cool with it because it's well written,
Right.
and there's great story development in it. I'm really in it for. I'm enjoying watching how Mark is developing. I'm enjoying watching how all his comrades are alongside him are developing and changing. And to me, that's something that you're finding in indie books, but that's something that's been lost in corporate books. Because what ends up happening with corporate books is, and this is the reason why we see these movies, you always keep getting you get origin stories over and over again. So a
Yeah.
character gets established, and then that's it. That's the character's not really growing from that place. Um, and what makes a story, honestly, is character growth. And this is one thing. So this is one thing that as people kind of, grow out their stories and grow out their universes, um, like a Batman and a Spider-Man, I think one thing they did exceptionally well was they created over time an excellent rogues gallery.
Hmm.
And to me, that does a number of things for you, because you got to have constant movement and constant growth in your characters. What an excellent rogues gallery does for you is it lets your character plateau, and you can tell the stories of different characters. Because the thing that you notice, and I'm not saying plateauing is a great thing, but like you want to at least let your character marinate where they are for a while,
Right.
and you have this interesting rogues gallery. And I think I first really grabbed a hold of that with Bruce Timm's Batman the Animated Series,
Mm.
because if you watch that, and honestly, a lot of those stories were almost the villain was the main character,
You're right. I never thought about that, but you're right.
and the villain went through their arc, like
Yes.
Mr. Freeze going through his arc of heartache. These different characters going through their arc, and Batman was really he was almost the antagonist to those villain.
Yeah.
They're not heroes, but they're villains. The
Right.
villains telling their story, and and Batman is their villain because
You're
Batman is the one
right.
for them.
There's a difference between protagonist and hero. Like
Yes,
Batman's the hero, but he is the antagonist.
but he's the antagonist. He's
Yes.
he's he's the one to their story. He's the
Yes.
one he's their villain.
Right. No,
And
that's
I
awesome.
and I like that because because what it does, honestly, for me is it helps build out your world, and it helps you also um, to get, I think, even your characters more firmly established. So when they do grow, it means something.
Yeah.
Because people, I feel like it happens one of two ways. Either a character is developed and then they're just stagnant,
Hmm.
or the character is just changing and growing, which isn't necessarily a bad thing, but you're like, people don't grow that way. You know what I
Right.
mean? It's like you learn a lesson, maybe you need that lesson a couple of times. Maybe you need that same lesson multiple
Yeah.
times. There's some things in my life that I've been dealing with probably for way too long.
Right.
Some lessons I just haven't learned.
Yeah.
And the circumstances will show it, and it'll come and bite me in the butt. So I really feel like comics is a medium where you can, especially, and that's what I love about world building and with these stories. It's like you have a Batman story, but then whose story are you really telling? Some of my favorite Batman stories were stories where Batman was either just a villain or was just a dynamic character. And I mean, look at Killing Joke.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? I mean, that story, Batman was an important character in that story. That story was about the Joker.
Yeah.
That story was about the Joker. you know. And the thing is, when you have a well-built world, um, you can develop different characters, keep your world moving, and that's one of the things that I appreciate about Robert Kirkman. I see him doing that in Invincible. So you see Mark's growth. Then he starts to give you focus on Eve, and you see Eve's growth. You see this whole crazy relationship between him and his dad, and how it's kind of coming full circle. You see what's going on. So none of the characters are stagnant, but some of them are moving faster than others. And then sometimes, Mark is just kind of he's kind of where he's at, and other things are kind of moving around him, but
Yeah.
it works.
Yeah.
The main thing is he doesn't fall back to who he used to be. And I know this is, it sounds weird because, like, I feel like if done well, you can have a very long run of a character arc, just like they've done with Invincible.
Right.
The worst thing to do is to finish telling, well, it's not the worst thing. If you finish telling a character story, then that story needs to end.
Yep.
And that's one thing that manga's got right. They realize that, like, hey, when the story's over, story's over. And part of the challenge that corporate comics have is they'll tell a story, but then they'll rehash it and they'll retell it another way. It's like, how many origin stories do we have for Wolverine? How many, and you're just like, man, you ruined it, bro.
Right.
And it's like, then they want to tell you all this stuff, and it's like some things you just don't need to reveal. Having some levels of mystery are the things that keep your stories moving forward. It's like, Star Wars. The Force is a spiritual thing. You don't describe it by science. You don't describe it by midichlorians. You ruined it. Dude.
Right.
You ruined it.
Yeah.
A show I used to love when I was growing up, or a while ago, was Superman, Lois and Clark. Love that. I love that show. That
I
was
did too.
a fun
I
show.
did too.
Had
Terry
Terry Hatcher, who was complete just fire, and you had Dean Cain, and it was dope. And that show fundamentally lost its steam once they got married. Because what happened was they had a particular drama that was going on when she didn't know. And the thing is, what they didn't do is they didn't figure out what's the next engine.
Right. Because
there could have been another engine.
Yeah.
If you've watched, I'm not watching a lot of the shows that are out there, but I am enjoying the CW's Superman and Lois.
Okay.
So one of the things that I like about it is they've figured out an engine for a married Superman and Lois and their kids. But the thing that you got to realize is, like, when you make a transition like that, you can't keep doing the same thing. At that point, you've made I guess a monumental, almost like a paradigm shift in your world. And once you make a paradigm shift, you've got to go in a different direction. And that's one of the things that I think Robert Kirkman does well as well. So, like, at the beginning of Invincible, it almost seems like a kiddie book.
Yeah.
It's just like, hey, these are fun adventures. Boom, boom, boom. Then once his dad does what he does, the book switches. It is no longer a kiddie book. You're like, okay, we just graduated.
Right.
We're now on another level.
Yeah.
And to me, it's like, if you're able to make the requisite shifts, because things are changing, if you're not holding so tightly to the past to try and keep things the way they were, you can continue to progress and tell fun stories and keep people along for the ride. I'll tell you, a TV show that did that really well was Vikings.
I haven't seen that.
Watch it. It's worth it, because what ends up happening is, and I'm not giving you spoilers, but you go through some generations.
Okay.
But they keep your attention. They keep you interested, because the thing is you probably think is, after the first generation, you're thinking, man, I love those characters, and I'm done.
Right.
But they made the pivots so that you could now get down with the new characters and move the story forward. You know, so you get to the end of the series, and you're like, man, there's only like one person that's here from the beginning, and it's not the person I expected to be there.
Right.
You know, so I think that's the trick, and I think as writers, it can feel like it's a little risky, and for corporate folks, they won't do it because they're going to feel like it's way too risky.
Right.
But I think as writers, we can enable our stories to progress. We can move our stories and our characters forward in a way that's fun, but that continues to grow the world without having to reboot. You know, because the problem for me with reboots is like, you know, the first time DC did Crisis, I thought it was really cool, and it was cool because it was novel. They're figuring out a way to bring everything, you know, into one universe because they had all these different universes. But from that point, you got to move forward. So I really enjoyed what they were doing initially, but you can't keep doing that. You can't keep rebooting it because then what ends up happening is I'm like, okay, now you're just erasing. Like when you buy a book, you feel like you're buying canon. And when you erase that, you know, then you're like, man, look, I'm out. I'm out. Yeah. You know, you erase some of my favorite stories from canon.
Yeah, that's why I could never get into DC Comics, was because all the into the world stuff that would happen, and they just kind of reset everything so often. I was like, I can't get into this. Yeah. So I was more of a Marvel guy, but now Marvel's doing it too. It's like, where do you go? What do you do?
Indie.
That's right.
Indie. This is where we are now. Yeah. And just like yourself, I mean, you've got stories to tell. There's never been a better time to tell our own stories. You know, so, you know, my big thing is like, if people have an unction to make comics, this is the time to do it. Yeah. You know, the community, you know, communities like CG are great because what they do is they give people, we're like a resource community to each other, and we're supportive. And one of the things that's challenging to me about comics, and it's surprising and it's sad, it's just, it's like a snake eating its own tail. Mm-hmm. I mean, people are after each other, but the thing that I enjoy about this group as a resource is that people are supportive. Yeah. You know, it's important, I think, for us to be able to lean on each other to help make books. And I think the next step is we got to get these books out beyond this community.
Right.
You know, whether you consider yourself that or not, I feel like we all need to be working together. We need to be getting books. It's a good thing that people are getting books made, but that can't be the end, you know, because what is a successful campaign? You know, I don't think I've done more than, I haven't done more than 300 backers on a book. You know, it's like, man, you know, that's, you know, we got the book made. That's good. But it's like, there's a whole world of people out there that know nothing about this book, but probably would be interested if they knew that it existed. So now it's incumbent upon me. It's incumbent upon all of us to say, okay, well, this is good. We're a great resource to each other in helping us get our books made. Now, how do we get those books, you know, proliferated, distributed, get them out there?
Yeah. Oh, that's really good. Let's talk real quick about the anatomy of the story, a good story. Yes. How would you break that down?
So, you know, I think with good stories, especially if you're doing a comic book story, you need to understand your world. So it's almost like role playing. Like, have you ever played role playing games?
Yeah.
I mean, it's like you've got an engine to the world. You got to understand how your engine works. So you got to understand the rules of the world. You got to understand your engine. You need to be able to develop your characters within that world. You know, your protagonists, your antagonists, your dynamic characters. You need to understand your main character. You know, what is their objective? The character has to have a goal, you know, and then you have to have, you know, your character, your goal, your path to getting to the goal, and you got to have your hurdles that you're jumping to get to that goal. And you can apply that, in creative ways. But because if you don't take people on a journey, then the story quickly loses its flavor. You got to take people on a journey where they get on board and they say, like, okay, I want to see where this is going. What's going down with this guy?
Right.
And then the bonus, especially in comics, is you've got abilities and powers to play with. And the abilities and powers, I mean, you got to use them. You got to make a fun story. Make your action scenes pop. Make your story just really fly off the page. But realize that at the end of the day, what's going to keep people going down that story arc is kind of your path, your character's journey.
Right.
So, and along the way of the journey, you have some really cool encounters.
Yeah.
When you're doing that and you're growing the character, you get to see, how the character's developing. You get to see if the character is overcoming, whatever, faults that they're dealing with. And sometimes the whole point is the character's not overcoming them, and then the consequences, behind that. To me, those are the things that drive good stories. When I look at different stories that I've loved, it's well-defined characters, especially if you're doing like a hero book.
Right.
If you're doing a hero book, you have to understand your different players in the book, and the beauty of it, like it's funny because one of the runs that I loved, but it was John Byrne's Fantastic Four run, and group books can be exceptionally challenging. But the thing that he did was almost every story or story arc, there was a different protagonist. So he had 4 characters to choose from. He'd tell Johnny Storm stories, and the rest of the 4 were kind of dynamic characters going along on his story. He'd tell stories with Reed Richards, with Sue, with Ben, and then Ben left, they picked up the She-Hulk, and they started telling stories with different, and the thing that you realize that it was always vibrant. When a group book is done that way, and I think Claremont is the one that really showed us how to do books that way. He did that with the X-Men.
Right.
And I think Claremont understood some things about some characters. The beauty of Claremont and his utilization of Wolverine is he realized that Wolverine isn't a character you want to show too much of, because the mystery to him is important.
Right.
He did a mystery around that character. So there was a Chris Claremont. If you don't have this, you need to get this. Chris Claremont, Frank Miller, Wolverine miniseries. It was when Marvel did some of their first miniseries. They did 4-issue miniseries.
Okay.
One was the Wolverine, one was the Falcon. And it's a Chris Claremont Wolverine miniseries, first miniseries. So you got to understand, you're reading Chris Claremont and John Byrne doing X-Men. And then, so, I mean, amazing runs. And they say, man, we're gonna do a Wolverine miniseries. So what are you thinking to yourself? Oh, they're finally going to tell us the story of Wolverine's origin.
Right.
Chris Claremont's too smart for that. He tells a Shakespearean love story.
Wow.
Basically, it's a 4-issue basically love story with Miller art of Wolverine going to Japan, and basically that whole thing with Mariko and her dad being the Yakuza boss, and man, it's like seriously like a Shakespearean story. He doesn't touch on Wolverine's origin. He just shows how awesome Wolverine is.
Right.
But also how tragic he is.
Yeah.
And I'm like, that's what good writing does.
Yeah.
I mean, we came away from that, honestly, not knowing anything more about Wolverine's origin than we did in the beginning. When we came away from that, we were like, oh man, this is so dope.
That's awesome.
You
have to check that out.
You have to check that out.
Yeah.
You have to check that out. I mean, just gems, absolute gems. Those are well-written stories, well-conceived stories where they're showing you stuff about the character, right? So you learned a lot about who Wolverine was through the things that he did. It wasn't through a bunch of just written exposition. It was like you saw what the dude was doing. You saw what he was about. You saw what his code was, through this kind of, like I said, Shakespearean tragic love story.
Right.
And you learned a lot about the guy. You didn't learn his origin, but you learned, okay, I know, I feel like I have a better handle on who this guy is. And to me, when you do stories that way, man, that's when you fall in love with characters.
Yeah. Not like knowing his like love story that kind of humanizes him as well.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's the whole thing. I mean, you got this guy who's the world's greatest killing machine.
Right.
And then you realize, man, Wolverine, he's got a heart.
Yeah.
His, and even though he's made of adamantium, his heart gets broken.
Right.
And you're like, man, you got some guy who's amazing, but you can still relate to the guy.
Exactly. Yeah.
So man, to me, that's why I will always love comics. I've gone full circle with different media, and comics are my favorite medium.
Same here, man. That's awesome. That's why we do what we do.
That's it, brother. That is why we do it.
That's right. So do you have any advice you'd give to a young writer?
Yes. Write a lot. Sometimes people say that they get writer's block. Write through it. Everything you write doesn't have to be an opus. Just write. I mean, there have been times when I've written stuff that's been almost relatively random, but I've pulled some really cool jewels out of that and used it in different stories. There's sometimes I've written stuff and none of that stuff has gone anywhere. But there's something to the process of creating. You get yourself in the flow of creating, and you become uninhibited. I think a big problem that we have societally is that, we want to write when things are, okay, when I'm in the mood.
When it feels good.
Man, it feels good. Oh, I've got this. I'm struck with inspiration. Yeah. Man, a lot of days I'm not struck with inspiration. Mm-hmm. So I write. And sometimes the things that I write, it may be just, I oftentimes try to write things related to stories that I'm doing, but sometimes I'll just write something random, and you never know how those things either come to play or don't, but it frees you to continue to write. So my biggest advice is write every day, and don't make it an eternal, don't make it like a burden, like this eternal burden. I knew somebody that's, he had to write a certain 1,000-something words a day. I'm like, don't do that to yourself, man. Don't do that to yourself.
Ouch.
I mean, there are days where I'll just write a creative paragraph. Yeah. Well, I'll write a paragraph that isn't even all that creative. I'll just riff off of something that happened.
Yeah.
Because sometimes, fact is stranger than fiction. You hear some stories, I'm like, that's absurd. How could that go down? You know what I mean? You write that out, you're like, oh, that's absurd. No, it's like I'm just kind of fictionalizing something that really happened. Because sometimes you write things, you're like, this is stupid. So that's my main thing. My main thing with writing is to write. When you're in that place where you're creating your content, whether you're making your book, getting an editor early is important, because what an editor's job is to help you tell your story. So there's some people that are fan fiction writers that are masquerading as editors. An editor's job isn't to rewrite your story. That is not an editor's job. An editor's job is to help you best tell your story. That's an editor's job. Now, if the editor is just like, hey, what you're doing is, the way you're going about this, then hey, take that feedback. And this is what I think about all those things. At the end of the day, especially being a self-publisher, it's just advice. It's just like having,
Right.
it's just like somebody running a company and the advisory board tells you something. Take it into advisement.
Yeah.
I take that into advisement. That doesn't mean I'm going to do it all,
That's right.
but it's good to at least have somebody kick things back to you.
Right.
And then you can say, like, let me think about that.
Yeah.
Let me go back and forth on that. Because oftentimes it's a balancing act. Oftentimes there's some nuggets of truth in there and you just got to find them. But because the fundamental issue is, at the end of the day, editors are just people too. So what ends up happening is sometimes people have certain things, like certain proclivities. And instead of, and what they're really dealing with is, there's just certain elements of the story that, I'm not a big fan of. It's like, oh, I'm not a big, these are horror elements and I'm not a big horror person. But that's not the point.
Right.
It's not about whether someone has a proclivity for a particular genre. A good editor can flow between genres and say, like, no matter what it is you're doing, hey, you know what? I see where you're going with this part of the story. I see where you're trying to get to. Hey, this may be a more effective way to help you get to where you're trying to get to.
Right.
And if you have a good editor, they can help you out early in the process. So when you get your scripting together, but you get to your artist, and your artist is really able to, and this is just the way I go about it. Different people do it differently. Some people like to give their artists very loosey-goosey stuff.
Yeah.
And to me, I'm like, that's like you're asking the artist to do your job. You're asking the artist to write the story. I like to write it out.
Yeah.
I like to really write it out, but then the artist can see what I'm trying to do. So then if the artist has any questions, or if the artist has an idea that, like, hey, I see what you're trying to do. I think we have a cooler way of doing what you're trying to do. To me, that liberates them to say, like, hey, instead of I'm the writer, but I'm making you create.
Right.
Because that was, the Marvel way worked back in the day when you had people that were multi-talented and cared about the stories. You could use the Marvel way with somebody like a John Byrne or a Frank Miller. If a John Byrne or a Frank Miller is drawing your book and you want to leave those dudes to do the story, heck yeah.
Right.
All day, every day.
Yep. Also, you only had like one writer working with like 5 or 6 different artists.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right. So you realize that an editor, I think, is an important team member. But the beauty of being a creator and an independent creator is you're still the CEO.
Yeah.
You still get the last say. And honestly, it's okay. It's okay if you're like, hey, you know what? I may need a different editorial view on a particular book, because it's a relationship too.
Right.
And it's funny because my wife, she's much more of a technical reader, and her education is in education. So she edits for me. So she's not huge in comics, but she can tell when a story is good. So you don't necessarily have to have somebody that is all in on comics like you are.
Right.
You just need somebody that, has the sense of what a good story is, isn't trying to override your story. Because like for her, she's very much a technical writer. So she's not trying to come in and do all this stuff creatively to the story. She's just like trying to make sure that the story is headed down the path that it should be headed down, or if it should even be going down that path.
Right.
Those are all fair. Those are all fair questions.
Yeah.
But your editor shouldn't be coming back rewriting your story.
Right.
That's fan fiction.
There you go.
They're just doing fan fiction on your story at that point.
All right, well, we're about to wrap it up here in a few minutes. So why don't you go and tell us where people can find you and your books?
Yeah, you can find me at Beyond Time Inc. on Twitter and on Instagram and on YouTube. On YouTube, I do have a stream where I've about 6 episodes into talking about creating comics. So if you're somebody that's interested in creating comics, I definitely have benefited from a lot of different people's wisdom. So I'm trying to kind of consolidate that and put pockets of that on the stream. So, go check out those videos, and you can pick up my comics digitally either at my website, which is beyondtimecomics.com, or we've also been releasing the individual issues on Global Comics, which is a large network of comics. So you'll find thousands of comics there by a lot of different independent creators, some larger independent creators as well. But hey, I mean, I really appreciate you having me on here, brother.
Hey, no problem, man. I just subscribed to your channel.
Oh man, appreciate that, bro.
Yeah.
Most definitely.
Yeah, and
Definitely.
the link for your website is down in the description. I believe I got the right one. If not, it's probably that second one you were talking about.
Yeah, beyondtimecomics.com.
Okay.
Yes, sir.
Yeah, I'll add it on there.
I appreciate you, man.
Hey, thanks, John. I really appreciate your time, and I really enjoyed talking to you. I wish we had more time. Maybe we could do another episode sometime.
Let's do another one, man.
Awesome,
Let's
dude.
do it.
Yeah. All right, brother. Well, you have a good night, everybody. Thanks for watching. Peace out.
Peace out.